Let's see. Okay. Now we are recording. Hi, everybody. This is David P. France, and I'm coming to you from Basel, Switzerland. Before we begin this interview, I want to thank everyone for following the journey. We'd like you to share the video, subscribe to the YouTube and BitChute channels, David P. France TV. Yeah, and definitely tell your friends about it. We are, I believe this is our 40th interview, right? And today we are speaking with Omar Wasow. And Omar is an assistant professor at Princeton University, and he is also the co-founder of BlackPlanet.com. And we have a lot to talk about because, first of all, I'm going to ask you, how's it going, Omar? It's been a while, right?
Yeah, it has been a while. It's good to reconnect. Things are, all right. It's obviously a difficult time in America, and at the same time, I've been studying, protests in the 1960s, and so it's suddenly this work I've been doing somewhat in obscurity is now really relevant, and it's been. I'm grateful that the research I've done is sort of people are finding it useful in this moment.
Right. Specifically, what is it that you are teaching, or what is your subject at Princeton?
So broadly, I teach in two areas: kind of race and ethnic politics and statistics. And the research that's gotten a lot of attention recently is kind of at the intersection of those two, where I spent about 15 years looking at protest movements in the 1960s and the political consequences of those protests. And so, and in particular, looking at how different kinds of tactics used by protesters, nonviolent and violent resistance, and also kind of police repression, violent and more restrained, how those work together to kind of shape media coverage and then in turn shape public opinion and voting behavior.
Okay. And so you've been working on this. I mean, this has been the subject of your interest, and it's very interesting how you're at the center of the storm once again. I mean, just so you guys know, when I first met Omar, it was at MSNBC. I was working as a booker for the cable channel, and you were actually on TV at that time. You were a contributor of some sort. What show was it? I can't even remember what show. They just would pull you on some from time to time, right?
Yeah, so when MSNBC first launched, I mean, this is way into the vault, but the MS was for Microsoft, right? There's Microsoft Network, MSN, right. And then NBC, and so they were trying to make a show that was kind of like what happens when new technology and the news kind of converge. And I was working as an internet entrepreneur, and so they had me on as a regular kind of commentator, sometimes on news, and then later became more tech focused. And so they had a show or a segment they just called Friends, or The Friends or something. And I was one of like 30 kind of like, slice of America talking heads who would come on. And this was really before it had its kind of identity now. And so they were, it was an experiment. And the gift for me was that it gave me a chance to kind of learn the ropes of television in a relatively, sort of in an environment where there was room to make some mistakes and not have it be catastrophic.
Right. But the thing that was interesting is that I was brought in from the Charlie Rose show as a booker. Someone recommended me, and I didn't even know what a booker was. I was like, they said, well, when you get there, they'll tell you what it is, because the person couldn't even explain it. And then when I found out what exactly I was going to do, which was get people on television, it was probably the most perfect job for me, because I thought, well, everybody should be on TV. Everyone should have a chance. Everyone. So of course I went in with that mindset, and I was getting all kinds of people, right? So I had my eye on you because it was clear to me, and it's much clearer now, but it was clear to me that you were coming from a different perspective than most of the other people that were in the studio, let's say. Right. So you had this vibe, and I said, it wasn't something that I said, oh, I have to get him on television and this and that. But ultimately what happened is that when I was doing volunteer work for my university, the University of Pennsylvania, we put together a media summit, and I thought, if I can get Omar on, it would be great. And it was a big get, just so you know, that when you showed up, people in alumni relations were very, very shocked, right?
Well,
So,
I'm grateful for the invitation, and anybody watching now should know that like it's there was a moment in my life where I might have had some media cred, but then I became a graduate student, and
it went down.
a lot of that, yeah, then my status dropped a lot. So
Yeah.
it's your invitation might have been a peak in my life.
Well, I mean, look, let's go into exactly what you've been up to, because this is incredible. When people hear the story, right, your story, once again, it's going to be incredible. When it's going to be incredible for a lot of people, because there's so many different tentacles, and I want to make sure I cover them all. So when you're growing up, can you explain to us how you grew up, your mother, your father, what it was like for you? And it seems as if you may have grown up in a number of different places, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I mean, the short version of the story is, in terms of like the current research and the current moment, is both my parents were involved in civil rights activism. So my dad was doing voter registration as part of Freedom Summer in Mississippi. He was part of the cohort of young men, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, who, I mean, he wasn't with them, but those three young men were killed in Mississippi, right, murdered by white supremacists, and that was in the same group that he was. And so, I mean, he was putting his life on the line in a way that has always been a really, for me and for our family, and also, obviously for this country, a moment of, that I have a real reverence for. My mom was doing activism, helping to get young people from disadvantaged backgrounds into college. And so that was this kind of like, for me, that civil rights generation was kind of the greatest generation, right? And then I was growing up in New York in the 70s and 80s, and there was this shift in our politics from a focus and a concern, from these major milestone victories in the civil rights movement to a politics of law and order and tough on crime and repression. And so, from my early days as a teenager, I just had this puzzle, like, what happened? How did we go from civil rights to law and order? And that became an animating question. And even as, Black Planet was a success, and, I was getting all these wonderful opportunities, being on TV, doing tech reporting and stuff like that, I still had this question, like, where did law and order politics, how did that become so central in American, how did this taste for punitive criminal justice policy become the center of American politics? And that ultimately led me to leave being a tech entrepreneur and being a TV, commentator, to going back to graduate school and pursuing a PhD in African American studies, and then a master's in statistics and a master's in political science.
Right. This is very interesting to me. Statistics, and more so from one angle, and then we can call it cultural, some calls for historic. Right, so it really is the intersection, as you used earlier, of these two different worlds. And so, what was it like going through the process? I mean, describe what it is for someone that's in the PhD program for, at Harvard. What is that like? I mean, maybe it's because you've been in this environment for such a long time. It might be, this is what you're used to, but I think for a lot of people, they're curious as to what it's like to be in that environment.
Yeah, so let me, that's a great question. And let me answer it in two ways, right? So the first thing is, I had been an entrepreneur. I loved business. I loved creating things. And with Black Planet, we built the largest social network for African Americans, serving millions of people. And that was deeply satisfying. And I felt like we did really important work with that social network. But some questions don't have a natural business model, right? So if the question is, can you, offer free email to the world, then something like Hotmail is like a business that does some real service. But if your question is, how did we end up with mass incarceration? There's not a business model there, right? So that question really had to be answered for me in the context of going back to school.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what I wanted to do in understanding how did we arrive at mass, I mean, the important detail here is that a lot of people will have seen this plot, but if you look at incarceration rates in the United States between roughly 1900 and 2000, or now, it's relatively flat from 1900 to 1970. It goes up some decades, it goes down some decades, and then it just hockey sticks up, right, in the 70s and 80s. And so the question was like, what happened in that moment of maybe late 60s, early 70s that led to that inflection? And that was the puzzle. And I wanted to be able to address that, as you say, both historically, trying to understand like what is going on in American politics, American history, the long legacy of white supremacy in this country, and at the same time bring a lot of quantitative methods to be able to kind of try and tease apart like what can we show statistically that might allow us to make a causal claim about this was a really important factor causing this outcome we care about. And so it was the marriage of this, grounded both in history and, as you note, in kind of a strong tradition of both, culture and humanities and other things in African American studies with a more traditional kind of statistical social science.
Yeah. So let me ask you questions about Black Planet. How did you get the idea for this? Where did it come from? How long did it take to birth? Give us some background on this. I think this is also interesting because from what I understand, what I've been reading online, it's sold it to another owner. Do you have any involvement with Black Planet currently?
No involvement now. We sold it in like 2008. I went to graduate school in 2005. So I haven't been involved with Black Planet for about 15 years. But it was, it's actually, we launched it in 1999. So it's more than 20 years old. I mean, it's really, it's a war horse. And the basic idea was, I had grown up as someone who I was a nerd when I was a kid, and I loved computers, and I loved doing what was an early version of things like what we now think of as social media, which were then called bulletin board systems. Literally, your computer plugged into a phone line, that phone line called through a modem. People of a certain generation logged into things like AOL. This was just an earlier version of that. And I came out of college and just thought there's this opportunity to build, to create a place, a watering hole for African Americans. And in particular, this was a moment I think it's important to appreciate where the dominant story of African Americans and technology was the digital divide, right? So basically, almost any article about Black folk and technology was about the gap and the lag and the deficiencies. And I saw among my friends, there were all of these, lawyers and engineers and folk who were embracing technology, and that there was no online community that served them, right? And so when we launched Black Planet, I had friends who joked, right, like, who's going to use this? You and the 3 other Black nerds in America? But in point of fact, what people who were focusing on the deficiencies missed is that there was this generation of Black folk coming online, and that with Black Planet, part of what was so exciting is we gave people, an additional reason to come online, right? You could hang out with friends, you could make new friends, you could flirt, you could find a job, you could learn how to create a profile page using HTML, and people in turn use those skills to get other kinds of jobs because they were now more technically proficient. So it just became this engine of excitement and possibility that in turn, brought millions of African Americans to the internet. In a moment when I should also note, and this is again a little in the weeds, but the dominant story about the internet itself was that it was going to be, the information superhighway, right? Like, what do we go to when we are on the web? We go to a web page, right? There was this very static, information-focused model of what the internet was going to be. And so in 1999, to be layering on top of that a social dimension was like a real breakthrough, right? It's not obvious now when everybody's on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, that social media was itself a kind of radical break from what people thought the internet was going to be. So we were breaking in some ways 2 barriers. One was this kind of big one about, no, we're gonna add social to the web page. And 2, we're gonna show that you have a narrative about Black people being behind, but we're actually going to be at the frontier building the leading edge of tech in a Black context for, what ended up being millions of African Americans.
Do you think that in the 70s and the 80s, around the time where there was an increase in mass or incarceration, there seemed to be a big shift in terms of the people that were coming through the education system, meaning that the population started to change drastically in terms of, and I think it began with our generation, maybe the second wave or third wave after civil rights. What are your thoughts on that? Because what I see is the same also in the tech. You were at the forefront of this movement. And now what we see is, I mean, people are on Facebook like it's nothing, right? I mean, it's quite amazing. And a lot of the ideas that I've had, even including putting this show together on the internet, happened through Facebook,
right,
through the socialization. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on. What is your opinion on that? I mean, it just seems like a shift that was happening in the 60s or 70s, late 70s, early 80s. And I think maybe it's specific to our generation that we can see things in a multitude of different ways.
Well, there are a couple of core shifts that are happening when we're becoming teenagers, right? So some of that won't be news to anybody today, but it was different then, which is that video games were becoming a mass medium, and so it went from being something that was only a coin-operated like a pinball machine that you had to spend a lot of money every time you wanted to play, I don't know, Pac-Man or something, to there were these, Atari game machines that suddenly put that kind of power in the home. I see that you might have logged a few hours on.
Yes, of course I have.
Yeah.
Of course I did, sure.
And I think we often think of video games as just like toys, but they're a medium. They're a way in which young people are, engaging in stories and narrative and making sense of the world and learning about technology, and learning about larger lessons about how the world works, right? In a game like SimCity, you're actually learning things about urban planning, right? So that's one thing, is that we're a generation that really even a few years earlier than us there was no home console that made it easy to play video games, right? So that's a big break. And then I think we're also maybe a little bit of a transition in that we're just old enough now to be in positions of authority, but young enough to be more tech savvy than people a little older than us. And so I often find myself kind of serving as a bridge between people who are just a little bit older than me and people who are like in their 20s, because I'm techie in a way that the people in their 20s are, and not the people who are a little older, right? And so I think that's another important factor that allows our age to be influential, maybe in a slightly different way. And then a third detail that maybe you're keying in on is I also see there's a kind of stair-step function with technology that let me explain that in a different way, right? So the first people who drove a car had to be essentially like auto mechanics. They had to know how to fix the car to run the car. And at a certain point, the car gets so kind of like good at running that you just turn it on. You don't have to know anything about cranking something in the engine, and occasionally it breaks and you go to a specialist. But it's kind of this hermetically sealed box that just runs, and you don't need to be an engineer. And that's great, but it also means you don't learn a lot about what's happening under the hood. And for a lot of people our age, technology was not so perfect when we were coming up that you could just like go to Facebook, and not have to know anything technical, right? So people who are your and my peers often needed to learn a little bit of programming to use a computer, or needed to learn HTML with Black Planet, even just a decade or so ago, to be expressive on the web. And now, part of Facebook's success is that you don't have to know anything about technology to use it, really. But it also means that you aren't learning much about technology when you use it, right? And so I think that way in which in an early period, as a technology is getting kind of simplified, the tinkerers learn a lot. And in a slightly later period, the people who come on don't have that tinkering experience, and as a result, are actually a little are deprived a lot of learning.
Mm. Well, it is fascinating. I think what I also see is that because we're sort of the bridge between the baby boomers and the younger generations, and it's more pronounced to me at this moment in which we're living, more so than ever.
Yeah.
One of the things I want to ask you, and then I'm going to ask you about your marriage and what happened in the last couple of years. One of the things I think I can now see as an American living in Switzerland is that I have a totally different perspective than most people that are here, and it gives me some advantage that others don't have, right? So
Yeah.
let's say when I'm working, I've had the benefit of working in the United States with some really interesting, smart people that see the world in an American way, right? Can you tell us, and I, with you, we could have like 3 different examples. We can talk about your being biracial, having different parents from different cultural backgrounds. We could talk about the fact that maybe where you grew up and you went to Stuyvesant High School, right?
Yeah.
What I read. So let's say going to, that school versus maybe everybody else in New York, because from what I understand, there were only a few public schools that you had to take tests for in order to get in, et cetera, et cetera. And this is at this moment, there's a big controversy around people of disadvantaged backgrounds being able to get into these schools. We could walk with you. You have like 1, 2, 3. You have a lot of different things that we could look at from different angles. So like, what is that like for you? Or can you give us an idea, similar to the question I asked about being at Harvard? What is it like when you have these 2 different worlds in so many different areas that you can?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
No,
I think part of what you just keyed in on is a kind of key insight, right? That as somebody who has spent time in the US and now Switzerland, like you can kind of see the world through different lenses. And there used to be a saying in the early days of the internet that perspective is worth 10 IQ points. A point of view is worth 10 IQ points. And so I think, just to use your example, right? It's like you can, in a American context, sort of say, oh, like, well, this is how this is what a European perspective might be, and this is what an American perspective might be, and this is what a Black American perspective might be, and that each of those perspective shifts gives you the ability to potentially like see new opportunities in solving a problem, or to maybe empathize with people who are kind of like, whose voices aren't being heard, and that's a very powerful way of essentially, in some ways, again, being kind of smarter in the world, right? That like having only one point of view can be very powerful, but there are lots of problems that actually kind of need different points of view. So there's actually, I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, but there's amazing work by a social scientist who does stuff on complexity named Scott Page. And he has found both in, there's a lot of social science on this, but he's also done kind of mathematical modeling, that diverse teams often outperform more homogenous teams. So the way I think about this is like, I had some friends who were all elite educated lawyers, and they were on a trip where they were going snorkeling, and they needed to get from this boat to the beach to get set up. And as they're swimming from the boat to the beach, one of them, who isn't very comfortable swimming, panics and starts to like freak out and potentially drag other people to drown them. They all get to the shore, it's fine. But the 15-year-old boy who was helping everybody kind of get to the shore, who's kind of working with the boat, says, if you had put your flippers on before you got in the water, swimming from the boat to the shore would have been really easy. You wouldn't have panicked, right? And the point being that adding another elite educated lawyer to that group wasn't going to help solve the how to prevent somebody potentially drowning. And in this case, having this different point of view, a 15-year-old who spends a lot of time in the water, like that was the key, right? And that you see this in science, that oftentimes there's studies that look at, they've looked at the names of on papers, and they find that when you have papers that have more different nationalities, those papers, it turns out, are cited more often than ones that seem to be more homogenous, right? So there are a bunch of ways in which you can understand that just adding more of the same point of view may not actually improve your ability to solve problems. So now coming back to your question, at the level of an individual, I think it can be really helpful. And it doesn't have to be that you grew up in a mixed race household. It doesn't have to be that you live internationally. But I think the core of it is the ability to kind of sit with ideas that make sense to you, and also to sit with ideas that are potentially coming from a different perspective. And so like on Twitter, one of the things I try to do is to, like, when somebody comes at me hard, is not just to say, no, you're wrong. Although sometimes I want to, like, I want to battle, but it's also to say, okay, like what's the kernel of truth that might underlie that point? And what can I learn from that point? And that kind of perspective taking, I think, can be very powerful for both improving my research as a social scientist, but also in terms of just having some humility about your own ideas of the world. And that humility can be, I think, a very powerful way to kind of walk in the world. So I'm each of the different vantage points you described. I was born in Kenya, like grew up partly, as you noted, outside of the country. Like each of those things gives me a different point of view. But I think the more generalizable thing, which is not just like, about parentage or where you were born, is this idea of really trying to sort of not take your own point of view as the one right way, but to be able to say, okay, I'm going to try on a different hat. I'm going to try and like look through different eyes, and that is not just going to be something I do as a kind of, some sort of rote exercise because I'm asked to do it, but really a way it's a kind of muscle building for the mind. It's a kind of muscle building for empathy. It's a way to be smarter.
Oh, yeah. It's fascinating. Let's jump into a couple of years ago. Not recently got married, so it's been a while. But you were married. I think it was 2011, 2012. Was it?
Yeah, 2012. I'm impressed that you caught all of that.
Yeah, well, and give us a story, because this is another story, you guys. I mean, just to give you guys a little bit of intro, is that I was on social media, and you and I are connected on social media, and I started to see this video or this documentary about your wife and what she was going through medically, and it fascinated me because for what, I'm here, I guess, in Switzerland. I'm working in pharma, and I started to feel, just to give you a little bit, and then I'll tell you a little bit more what happened to me. I was going through some sort of symptomatic, or I had issues with body pain, something very similar to what your wife had described. Not right on point with what I had, or may still have. But tell us more about what happened. So you're married in about 2012, 2011.
Yeah.
And this was at Harvard. You met your wife, Jennifer?
Yeah. So we were both graduate students, and I was smitten with her for a while. She didn't pay me much mind, but luckily when I proposed, we got engaged, and then got married in 2012. And between the engagement and the marriage, she started having some weird health issues that we couldn't quite make sense of. And ultimately she was diagnosed with what's been called myalgic encephalomyelitis, or historically chronic fatigue syndrome. And it turns out that is an illness that has this, it's been around for decades and has largely been treated by science and medicine as a kind of modern form of hysteria. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that is just, this is a kind of profound disregard, in that what was happening is a patient population that was maybe 70 to 80% female was just being treated as that they're making it up. And what we've seen in a wave of biomedical research particularly in the last decade, is that there are these profound physiological changes that science and medicine had the wrong idea, that they had the wrong theory of this illness, and that there are these essentially biological bases of what's underneath the illness. And so, as we were trying to make sense of what was happening to her, we were trying to, because science and medicine and also government funding of research had the wrong theory of the illness, you as a patient are just kind of cast out of medicine because it had so little to offer. And so it was partly a film about our struggle to make sense of this. It followed other families, actually 2 in Europe and 2 additional ones in the United States. And what do people do when the world throws them a curveball? How do you make sense of your life when the rug gets pulled out from under you? And so it's partly a story about the illness. It's also partly a story about fighting for dignity and meaning when the deck is stacked against you. And remarkably, I mean, my wife was the director. She was quite ill when making the movie, and so much of it is shot. She's directing from bed in our apartment in Princeton, our house in Princeton, and she had hired crews around the world to go and do shoots, and through wireless internet connections is able to kind of give sort of talk about how a shot should be blocked out, and makes this movie directed largely from her bed, that goes on to debut at Sundance, gets shortlisted for the Oscars, is on Netflix, Unrest, if you're curious. And it's actually, just because of the current moment, it seems to be having a bit of a second life, because in this moment of the COVID pandemic,
Absolutely.
there are a lot of people who are experiencing similar kinds of symptoms to what people in what's now often called the MECFS, myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome community, where they have kind of profound, what's sometimes called post-exertional malaise. They feel good, they go out, they walk, and then they're knocked out for days. And so people are, and there are a bunch of patients, and I'm sure you had some experience of this too, when you have symptoms that medicine can't quite measure perfectly, often they're just described as, no, you're imagining it. And that's what we're seeing. A bunch of COVID patients, they have what's being called long COVID. They're not fully recovering, and medicine is sort of saying, oh, no, this is psychological. And it's like, no, we've seen this over and over again in medicine, this misdiagnosis and this miscategorization, and that's it's a part of what I think her film does a lot of work in the world to do, is to help people say, oh, no, this isn't about patients being wrong. This is about medicine having made a mistake.
Yeah. Look, what I had was, they diagnosed me with a number of different things, but the thing that stuck out was Lyme disease, or the tick that causes, they call it Brea. And I didn't have any marking of Brea on my skin. So people said, well, where's your bite? None. It was so bad that I could not, at a certain point, I couldn't walk.
Wow.
And I had to go to, I could walk, but it was painful. So
and for a dancer, that's sort of the core of your identity.
Well, I had just spoken to someone from the Philippines who was in business school. We were in business school together, and she had stage 4 cancer. So she basically told me how she heard from God that she just had to dance. So that's a whole other story. So of course, there's a reason why she and I connected years ago, and it was because she's very much a filmmaker, artist, and et cetera, et cetera. But that always stuck with me. And I had started flamenco here in Basel way before the illness started, because I sensed something was not correct, right? And so I started training, almost literally trying to stamp something, whatever is in my body, out of my body. Right. Then it got worse, and then I ended up flying to Mexico to get some sort of magnetic pulse therapy. I also went to Austria for ozone therapy, and I also went to Germany to have the blood filtered. Yeah. That was years ago. Now things are much, much better, but I had to go through a whole bunch of things very similar to what. Now, I didn't see the documentary, but I was following on Facebook, and you guys were funding it through, what was it, GoFundMe? It was a whole bunch of things going on. So, of course, in my mind, just like when we were at MSNBC, it was like I could see your story playing out while mine was going on, and I say, okay, I got to file that. I got to file that. So now, of course, years later in 2020, I'm contacting you. We're talking about it. I mean, it's amazing. I do think that there's something biological. I can't put my finger on it. Of course, no one knows at this point. I think years and years from now, what will happen is we'll find out exactly what was going on during this era, and you'll come back in maybe your fourth, fifth, or sixth installment and describe what happened from your role as professor, because I do think there's huge things going on.
Well, what we found, actually, I mean, the good coda, I mean, we're not out of this journey, this medical journey, but sure. The important detail in my wife's story is that she was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, which led to having having a thyroidectomy. And as part of that procedure, they tilt your neck back really far, and that led to a set of downstream symptoms, which were for us at a certain point quite terrifying. It seemed like things were getting much worse. Ultimately, that led to a diagnosis of instability at the sort of the juncture where the skull meets the spine.
Yes.
Something called cranioscervical instability. Fast forward, she then had a procedure where there's almost like two railroad tracks in the back of her, connecting her, the top of her spine to the bottom of her skull, lifting her skull just a few millimeters. And suddenly, like a lot of, she had this just a significant remission of her symptoms. And so what it appears to have been happening for years was there was this, I being a techie, I think of it almost like there's like an Ethernet cable or a power cable that was pinched, yes. And that the signal was getting wonky. And by lifting her skull just again the small amount, the spinal column, the juncture between the brain and the spine was no longer getting pinched, and all of these symptoms sort of again remitted in large part. And so we actually, through a series of unfortunate events, stumbled into what ended up being a really wonderful intervention, which was isolating that for her, and it turns out a lot of other patients, what's going on, it's not psychological, no. And it is physiological, and in fact, it might even be very specifically anatomical, and that if you can make these adjustments in the body, people have really significant recoveries.
So where is she at this point? I think I read she's in remission, or things are much better than they were when on years ago.
Yeah, so there's definitely still a lot of kind of post-surgical kind of physical therapy and work to be done. But last summer we went camping, and it's just been a very different life after she was bedbound for almost a decade.
Really? And it was 10 years.
Yeah, I mean it's about 8 years of and it's up and down. There are periods where things seem to get better, but the steady state was she was bedbound, and so and we were if we went out, she was in a wheelchair. I mean it was very demanding for her and hard on both of us, but we stuck together and have made made real progress. And so that's maybe to kind of pitch the movie one more time. If people are like, oh, I don't want to watch an illness movie, it's also a love story. we're really sweet on each other.
Yeah, well, we got that. That's the part I got, because I mean, clearly I was like, what's going on? Sometimes you'll see something, you go, what's going on here? You start digging or clicking or whatever. That's exactly what was going on, at least for my husband.
Yeah,
right. So
well, I'm glad that came through.
You made an impact. You really have. And I'm going to touch on this, and then we jump into what's happening now. I mean, Omar, when you look at all the things that you've done, right, and sort of the experiences that you've had, I mean, can you reflect a bit on it? I mean, it's pretty much, from my eyes, has been almost like a spectacular type of journey that you've been on, even probably at a very early age. Is that correct?
I mean, what's funny is everybody's life is in some ways normal to them, right? And so to be a black kid in Switzerland doing flamenco that's routine for you, but that's not that's not anybody else's typical life. No. And likewise, my life is it's boring to me, but I'm grateful that it seems interesting to others.
Oh my God,
and I guess I don't know that there's any lesson to be learned, except that I have tried in a couple of ways to be guided by questions that excited me, and also to do the work. And oftentimes, so there's a social scientist, a social psychologist named Carol Dweck, whose research was very influential on me. And the core of her finding, kind of the bumper sticker version, is effort makes ability, right? So a way to think about that is, I'm not much of an athlete, and people in my family, they were educators, so it was like nobody was like, you need to be a jock. And I started running as in my 20s, and I was never fast. But like one year I was running the New York City Marathon, and there was a banner that said, last place beats never entered. I thought that's a slogan I could get with, because it's like just showing up and putting in time, that counts for something.
Yeah.
And in a lot of contexts, particularly around education, how did I get to be a tech entrepreneur? I was tinkering with computers as a kid for a decade, and there was no big payoff. It wasn't like maybe I had jobs occasionally that were tech related, but fundamentally, my kind of investment in myself with technology was learning over time, getting better slowly, not in competition with anybody, not, trying to prove anything. And then at some point there was a payoff. And similarly, this research I've been doing on protests, there were times where people were like, people had real questions about what is this work? Why, what does protest in the 1960s tell us about politics today? That's not a question anybody asks now, but as recently as 2011, it wasn't obvious that the protest tactics, whether they're nonviolent or violent, had any particular relevance, right? This is pre-Black Lives Matter, pre-Trayvon Martin getting killed, and so I was doing this research for a long time because I cared about it, and because it sparked me, and I thought it had something to offer the world. And I'm lucky, I'm extremely lucky that it came out in a moment where people did care about it, but you can't plan your life around getting lucky. You can plan your life around putting in the work on things you care about, and having that being what I think of when I teach. I try to encourage my kids to be lit from within, right? Be internally motivated, have intrinsic motivation, and that's going to get you through the tough times. And then you can't control the world, so maybe you'll be lucky, maybe not, but at least you are doing what feels like is worthwhile. And I hope, as was my experience in education, acquiring skills and knowledge that allow you to make a contribution.
Well, clearly, what you're doing now is current, right, or is being used, because I listen to a lot of different internet news shows, and someone used you or your study as evidence of what happens when there are protests. And tell me if I'm right or wrong on this. It's basically saying when there are protests, politically the country where the protests take place starts to lean to the right as a result of the protests. And I guess give statistical data, or you give examples of that. But your name came up during one of these shows, and I was like, oh, that's a sign that I need to reach out to him. I know that I need to reach out to him. And I think I'd reached out to you a while back, and then heard your name again on the show. So explain to the audience what this means.
Yeah, thank you. So the basic puzzle is, in political science, there's a lot of work that says elites dominate political communication. So the first question is, can a marginal group, whether it's African Americans in the 60s, or maybe ACT UP in the 80s, or the disability rights movement, can a group that's at the margins of society, that's often loathed or ignored by many mainstream members of that society, can they have their voice heard? And there's a kind of growing body of work around protest that shows, yes, marginal groups can get their voice into the public discourse. And in particular, and this is where my work and some other work kind of adds a little bit to the conversation, by using something like protest, using some kind of disruptive tactic to draw media attention. And then when the media covers that, they are able to get their issues kind of in the public sphere. But importantly, the types of tactics that protesters use shapes the media coverage. So for example, when John Lewis is, famously has his head cracked open on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday in 1965, the images of state repression against nonviolent protesters it shot civil rights in public opinion surveys. Civil rights becomes the most important problem in the public's mind. 5 months later, the Voting Rights Act passes, right? So that's one example of using protests to kind of influence media, public opinion, and legislation. But what we also see is that when protesters engage in more aggressive resistance to white supremacy, they use violent tactics in response often to police repression. Then the story in the media tends to be a clash between protesters and police, and the headlines focus a lot more on things like crime and riots. And when the media attention is much more on crime and riots, then the public concern, just as in the earlier period, kind of follows the headlines and becomes much more focused on concerns about crime, concerns about order. And so coming back to the question that we were talking about at the very beginning of this, how did we get in part from civil rights to law and order? Well, partly politicians were very strategic and kind of, as Trump is doing now, talking a lot about law and order, but it's also partly what protesters are doing on the ground. And when protesters, a protest can be 1,000 people, mostly peaceful, but in the evening, some people light a building on fire. Well, that building on fire can often dominate the news coverage because it's powerful visually. From your time in TV, visuals matter a lot, and so then that can kind of shift the public perception. It kind of changes the conversation away from this concern about rights to a concern about to a focus on what's often called like a crime script. And the last thing I'll say, particularly as it relates to African American rights protests, is you can think about kind of two broad narratives in American culture, two kinds of mythologies, right? So one is, the claim for rights, a redress of grievances, the First Amendment assembly, and that has a kind of hallowed status. But there's also hundreds of years of racist mythology about, quote unquote black lawlessness, right? And that racist mythology is kind of right there below the surface for journalists, editors to kind of draw on when telling stories in the news. And so part of what was so clever about what civil rights activists were doing in the early part of the 1960s is they managed to take their status as underdogs and make it part of a long kind of redress of grievances narrative that very powerfully drew on kind of core, again, mythologies in American society. But as we saw then and potentially now too, that those crime narratives are also very powerful and can do, and potentially complicate a story of concern about police violence against unarmed citizens.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting also is, at least when I worked in media, it was clear that this lack of diversity in the newsroom actually hurt, in my opinion, hurt storytelling. And I can see it clear as day now, because I think, in my opinion now, I'm not necessarily 100% on this, but just based on what I see in mainstream media, there's still a lack of diversity in terms of the people that are just in the newsroom walking around. I mean, the faces might be changed a bit in terms of who we see now, but I also hear the content in terms of what's coming out. And I do think that if, let's say, this had been, what was that, I think it was 2000 when I met you, 1999, 2000, we would have had a leg up based on where we are now. I mean, basically, you've pretty much been researching this maybe almost all your life, some aspect of it. You've hit almost on every demographic. You hit on every This is the truth, right? It really is. And it's fascinating. What do you think is going to happen in the next couple of months? I mean, you told me that you've been getting calls and, the things that have been going on in Michigan and also Minnesota. I mean, what do you think is going to happen in the next couple of, after Labor Day? Because I think it's going to step up after Labor Day.
Yeah. So I mean, I think there are 2 or 3 dynamics to pay attention to, right? So one is, I found in the 1960s, violent protest contributed to rising concern about law and order, and that helped Nixon, who was running on law and order, beat Humphrey, Hubert Humphrey was the lead author on the Civil Rights Act, right? So you had this contest of a rights-focused president coalition and a law and order-focused coalition, and the law and order coalition won, right? So that's part of why there's been a lot of attention to my work, is people are looking at this election and saying, how much is it going to be like 1968? So there's some reasons at the same time to think this election will be different than 1968. So among them, the country's very polarized. And so a lot of people's opinions are kind of baked, right? We've just seen event after an event that might be a scandal for a typical president, unlike Trump, or for that matter, a gaffe from Joe Biden that might have been something that would, derail another candidate. And, and the public opinion has been quite stable. And so there's one, I think, reasonable hypothesis is that things aren't going to change much unless there's a really dramatic change on the ground in the United States. And that in November, Biden has a good shot at winning because he's up in the polls, right? So that would be, I think, probably the safest bet right now. Mm-hmm. But part of what's unpredictable is, why are there protests in Kenosha, right? Police shot a black man in the back who was walking away from them. Mm-hmm. And the video of that is enraging, and in people's anger and need to express themselves, we see protests that are mostly peaceful, but in the evening have escalated to violence, right? And then that becomes a big story. And, and then strategic politicians, Trump, Pence, others, hammer that story home, right? So it's possible that there will be other events. We know there will be other police shootings of unarmed black men. Whether that will happen between now and November, is anybody's guess. At the same time, there may be images like of Officer Chauvin resting all of his body weight on the neck of George Floyd, and those kinds of images can change politics. So there's some unpredictable things that between now and the election day, and then it's also what people do on the ground matters. And so it may be that the fact that athletes now are saying this is a legitimate concern, we're not gonna just treat this as business as normal, business as usual, and that helps elevate the legitimacy of this cause of what's happening in policing in America is unacceptable, right? And so there's a lot happening, and these key influential figures, again, media, athletes, play a really powerful role in shaping the narrative. And so I think that's a little unpredictable too, because it's the way I think of it is it's like it's like a standing ovation. And there are some early activists who, people are like the people at the front of an auditorium. And if they stand up, then people around them are more likely to stand up. And there are people like media and athletes who help amplify those early voices. And then there are people further back who aren't as influential and are saying, is my neighbor standing up? I don't want to be the only one back here to stand up, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's cascading through our society, and we're still in the middle of that, right? And so it's just a little hard to know how this is going to ultimately shake out. But the last thing I would say is public opinion so far has generally been pretty positive about the protests, even among whites. And there's a growing group of liberal whites who are much more concerned about issues of racial justice. Sure. And so that's different from 1968 too, and I suspect means that the dynamics won't play out in this quite the same way.
Well, it's interesting. I'm going to just throw out a couple of other things and then we're going to close. I've been working with younger students or people who've recently graduated, and it's interesting how the focus or the interest in social justice is just, it's huge. It's much bigger than I expected. Yeah, so that's one thing. So I think, in other words, I thought I would be on this road by myself. And when I say by myself, I think you know what that means. It's not like, it got to the point where everyone was sort of doing their own thing, at least in our generation, and it seemed to sort of go on its own course. And then all of a sudden there's this renewed interest I wouldn't say renewed, but almost a resurgence, right, from the younger generation. So what I suspect is that perhaps once they graduated, they started to see some of the same things that we experienced when we were coming into the workplace, only they said, okay, we're not going to have it, right? We're actually, because they were raised very, very differently than we were raised as a generation. So that's one of the things that I can see. Another thing is that their interaction with tech at this point is very interesting. So I'm a recent joiner to TikTok. Okay. And I was almost like, okay, I'm not going to do that because everybody's doing that. And, you know, I purposefully avoided it. And I will tell you that TikTok is an amazing app or platform. It is educational in a way that I didn't expect. It does something different in terms of the learning in the brain. So the two things that I say, the younger people are different, the tech is even faster, and then there's this idea or aspect of which is what I saw, and this is why I wanted to talk to you. On the TikTok, there are a lot of people of mixed parentage that are commenting on TikTok. And the way that it's almost all of these different viewpoints and cultural perspectives are converging, and you only get like, what is it, like 10 to 20 seconds or something like that to tell your story. So everything that we've talked about literally is sort of now at TikTok, and you get to know more about people just flipping the page. Have you tried TikTok? Have you seen this app?
So I've definitely used, I mean, I am a, what they used to call a lurker on TikTok. I enjoy looking at people's videos. I have not made my own. You know, some people have a certain kind of talent for things like dance. So I could see being a real star. Well, I'm an okay dancer, but haven't you know, put myself front and center. So, but yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right that it's young people are much more concerned about social issues. And I think part of the way these technologies interact with, you know, a younger generation is it's one thing to read about, you know, I don't know, let's call it a lynching in the 1800s, right? That is awful, but it's still a little abstract if you're reading about it. Whereas if you see the video of George Floyd being killed, like it's not abstract, right? Like here is a cop with a kind of almost sociopathic, callous indifference to life, squeezing the life out of another person, right? Like resting his full body weight on the neck of another person. And we see George Floyd, you know, resisting, crying for, you know, trying to fight for his life. But we see the life drained from his face, right? And so if you're a young white person, or for that matter, anybody non-Black, or for that matter, Black and maybe more middle class and, you know, kind of buffered from some of that, you get, through the power of media, to have a more visceral, intimate connection to that injustice. And that's what people were doing in the 1960s as well, right? Mamie Till is very strategic about putting the images of her brutalized child's face, right? I mean, he is a lynching of the 1950s, and the images of his brutalized body in the term that was used then shocked the conscience of the nation. And similarly, you know, for our generation, seeing Rodney King beaten shocked the conscience of the nation, and seeing George Floyd being killed, but in a way that's even more intimate than the kind of grainy footage from, you know, maybe 100 feet away of Rodney King being beaten, is, you know, it's hard to look at that and not say something is profoundly wrong. And we saw police forces criticize that. You know, people on the right criticized that you know, Chauvin's killing of Floyd. And so that kind of, you know, and why does that happen? That happens because a 17-year-old named Darnella Frazier has the presence of mind to bear witness with the video camera on her cell phone. Sure. And that act of bearing witness, you know, transforms our politics in this moment. And that's something that young people are both doing, you know, whether it's TikTok or Facebook or whatever, they're doing in the kind of documentation they do of their lives, but it also when it comes into contact with some profound social injustice, can have this, the act of a single teenager can have this remarkable effect in a way that in the past really required, NBC or ABC to be there documenting.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. And look, it's why I'm here on the internet speaking with you now. I'm going to let that be the final word. I mean, look, it's been great talking to you. It's a refreshing for me. I mean, it's funny because I have all different types of people that I've gone to school with, and maybe people don't necessarily see me as a nerd, or as you said, or a techie. In some way I am, right? They see me as a dancer first, so you are correct about that. They see me, but there's a lot more, right? And it's one of the reasons why when you have these different people coming together, there's so much that can be done. So I want to thank you for taking time out from your schedule. I know you have some things that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Really, really grateful to kind of have this opportunity to talk about the as you said early on, all all the different threads that come together in this work.
Look, it's incredible. Like, I mean, your name was like it very much when we were at MSNBC. It's like, this guy's doing something different. This guy's doing something different. And of course, because I do different things as well, right?
Right. A kindred spirit. Yeah.
I'm checking in. And in Switzerland, I've met those people as well. But the funny thing is that they started coming to me before I could. They figured me out before I figured them out.
Right.
I was like, oh, they're coming over to, what are they talking to me about? What do they want?
Well, anyway. James Baldwin has this line that there's some secrets that are only secret to the person keeping the secret, and your spidey sense is good, and I think I'm still kind of figuring that out about myself. But I'm grateful for this opportunity, and wish you well.
You as well, and I will get this uploaded as soon as possible, and let you. I think we're connected on Facebook. If not, we will make sure that you get a copy and that you're tagged and so on. So, okay. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Okay.
Thank you. Take care, David.
Take care.